I have a very special guest tonight. His name is Richard Sauder, and he is an author and an author of books that I find actually to be extremely fascinating. I love the topics that we're going to be discussing tonight. So, Richard, are you there with me?
Yes, Ira, thank you. I'm right here.
Awesome. Okay, so before we really get into delving into the topics, why don't you tell the listeners a little bit about yourself, and that way they can have an understanding of where you're coming from and what you're all about.
Well, Ira, I was born in 1955 in Tidewater, Virginia. So I'm a native Virginian, a native Southerner. I grew up on the East Coast of North America. I got a bunch of degrees along the way in sociology, forestry and ecosystem management, Latin American studies, political science, and then I lived and worked in many different states in the United States. Over the years, I also been a peace activist, an anti-nuclear activist. I've been arrested many times for staging nonviolent peace demonstrations, including directly on the launch lids of nuclear missile silos in Arkansas, Missouri, and most recently in North Dakota on April 15, 2010. I have been incarcerated for those demonstrations. I spent a fair amount of time in many different jails, prisons, and correctional facilities in various states in the United States. Along the way, I also wrote a little series of popular paperback books on the topics of underwater and underground bases and tunnels, many of which are secret, not all of them, but many of them. And most recently in 2010, I flew to Ecuador on a shamanic vision quest, which I had wanted to do for years and years and years. And finally, at the age of 55, I decided if I'm going to do it, I'm going to do it. So I counted up my pennies and bought a plane ticket to Quito and flew down and spent a month in Ecuador, traveling around the country, and somewhere around 3 weeks into the ostensible vacation or shamanic exploration or vision quest, I was walking on the beach and contemplating life and decided I'm not going back. I'm going to remain in South America, and so here I am to this day.
So basically, it was a really transformative experience all the way around. Do you feel like it was a kind of a culmination of your life to be down there, I guess you could say?
Well, in one sense, in that since childhood, the age of 9, 10, 11, I had been fascinated. When I first heard about the Mayan cultures and the Inca culture, I've been fascinated by ancient Mexican and ancient Andean culture, and I even had a book on the Mayans and another book on the Inca, which I would read, at the age of 10 or 11 years old. So that burr got into my mind at a very early age, 50 years ago, and then I went away later when I was somewhat older and did one of my master's degrees is in Latin American studies. And I ended up visiting Mexico, and I traveled pretty widely in South Central and Southern Mexico. I traveled extensively in the Mayan area and also in Guatemala, visiting many ancient Mayan ruins. And then, of course, the desire for a vision quest was something that had been a very strong wish for years and years. I've had many visionary experiences and paranormal experiences over the years, beginning at the age of 3, and those have never really ended. So, of course, along the way, I heard about shamanism and South American shamanism, and I determined I really wanted to visit the Amazon region and drink ayahuasca. So I did, and ayahuasca proved for me to be revelatory. My experience with ayahuasca has not been like a lot of the typical experiences you might read on the internet on various entheogenic web pages that have to do with the various shamanic plants that are used around the world. Nonetheless, I did have a lot of deep insights with ayahuasca, and if you like, we could get into some of that. I don't know. But one thing that resulted from that within a matter of just a few weeks was that I decided to remain, and I had a round-trip plane ticket. I was scheduled to fly back to Atlanta, and as I thought over things, I began to wonder, yeah, I'm flying back to Atlanta and to the United States, but to do what? And I began to feel as if my work in the United States was done, and that I was beginning a new chapter of my life in South America. I still feel comfortable with that decision, and as of today, I firmly intend to remain in South America, probably in Ecuador, since I've been here almost 5 years.
That's really amazing. It sounds actually a lot like my own story, except for the Ecuador part. I've lived a very paranormal life myself, and I'm Native American myself, actually, of the Miami tribe, and I've had quite a few vision quests of my own. I've never actually tried ayahuasca, but I've tried other things and used other medicinal means to enact the vision quests and so on and so forth. And it's always a very fascinating experience, especially when you come from it. Come at things from more of a scientific viewpoint on it, as opposed to more of a traditional viewpoint. You kind of get a little bit more out of it, I think, actually, when you come at it from a scientific viewpoint.
Well, yes and no. What I found is a lot of the indigenous shamans, not all of them, but many of them, have very little so-called formal education. Many of them have never traveled much, if at all, beyond the rural parts of South America where they live. They oftentimes have a lot of superstitious beliefs that may or may not correspond well to what we might call objective reality. There's alcoholism involved in Native culture, let's tell the truth. And that has a very negative effect on a lot of shamanism.
It does, yes.
There's also violence against women. That's pretty common in Native culture, whether in North America or in South America. And that lack of respect for other human beings also has a negative effect on shamanism. And I know a lot of shamans will say, well, we're one with nature and with Pachamama, who is the one word that's widely used, at least in India and South America, to describe Mother Nature, if you will. And, we're one with Pachamama and we're one with nature and we're all seeking God. And they'll tell you that, and then they're drinking alcohol and they're beating their wife.
Right. Yeah, I wonder how much, because I've never really done a large amount of investigation into the South American tribes and their methodologies, but I know a lot of the ones up here in North America, for instance. And I know that up until about maybe 120 or 150 or so years ago, that was not really a problem. And ever since that point in time, it really seems to have become more prevalent. And I wonder maybe
the conquest has changed everything.
Yeah.
I wouldn't minimize the very damaging and violent and degrading effect of the mainstream culture that's been
because
imposed.
that causes a deep trauma in the genetic makeup even of
well,
that
Ira,
peoples.
It actually killed a lot of people to begin with.
Oh yes.
So that's very traumatic in and of itself. And those who survived, of course, were carrying that emotional trauma from witnessing others being killed and fearing their own potential demise by violent means. So there was the hyper-violent aspect of it, but then having the culture overwhelmed by this very foreign global culture. It's really a global culture that has come in with alcohol. I mean, I saw in a lot of the Native communities in North America, the young men, they're idolizing rap music and and this urban hip-hop culture, which
Yes.
glorifies brutality of women. It glorifies drug dealing, narcotics trafficking. It glorifies gratuitous violence, pistol whipping people,
Yep.
shooting people, getting down with the homies in the hood. And so what you have is all these young Chippewa men, Ojibwe and Sioux and Navajo and on and on. They're violent. They're drug addicts. They're narco traffickers. They're alcoholics. They're pimps. And they believe that's the lifestyle they have chosen, and they're actually patterning it off of the very violent and dysfunctional, poor urban black culture. And that's the reality in a lot of native areas in North America today. I've seen it.
Yeah, it's what I've come to call the Slapaho generation. Because that is really what it comes down to.
It's the end of traditional Native American culture.
Yes.
In North America.
Yes,
it's
and
the end.
I wonder. Well, I don't wonder. I mean, I know that the answer is when you look into the history of what's happened, not just with the genocides that have gone on over the years with the native tribes, but also look into what even happened up to 70 or so years ago, where most of the children get removed from the reservations and put into different like Catholic charities and wards and group homes and all of that kind of stuff. And the native literally was beaten out of them anytime that they displayed anything of their native traditions or had their hair long or anything like that. It was, they were violently struck out against because they did not want to appear savage. So a lot of those children never even went back to the reservations again because they grew to hate where they came from. And that caused a huge devastation into the tribes. They still have not recovered from any of that. So,
no, it was a very dark, brutal period, and unfortunately, Native peoples are not the only ones who have been treated like that. You see, that agenda has not been restricted just to so-called Native peoples in North America. It's really a global conquest agenda.
You're right.
You can see I'm not minimizing what has happened to Native peoples in North America. It's just been demonic. There are hardly words to describe it, but it's not restricted to them. And look at what was done to Vietnam in the 1960s and 1970s.
Yes.
Look what's being done to Syria right now, to Iraq, to Libya, to Afghanistan. And look what's been done in Indonesia, in Central America, and on, just in country after country, region after region, all around the world. This is a centuries-long campaign of horror that's being inflicted on humanity. We have to inquire into where it comes from. And by the way, a new chapter is getting ready to be opened. This is a multi-chapter saga. It's once started, it hasn't ended. It's ongoing. And another chapter is about to be opened with this so-called Jade Helm military operation that the United States military is going to initiate starting next month in several states in the United States. And actually, these military operations are ongoing. I read about one on the internet today that's taking place in Michigan right now, in Flint, Michigan.
Yeah, I just ran across that here a little while ago myself. There was a big explosion in the town.
Exactly. They're setting off explosions. They're having maneuvers in and around the city. Evidently, they're having a military operation in an abandoned junior high school in Flint, Michigan. I'm sorry, if they're having that kind of training in an American city, in a junior high school, and they're setting off explosions, the military trains for the war they're going to fight.
Yes.
So if that's their training, then it's clear as hell they're getting ready for war on the North American continent. Now, I know there were the so-called Indian wars in the 19th century, which were more massacres and slaughters than they were wars. But what I'm telling you is something like that is coming, and probably even worse, frankly, Ira.
I see the same thing, and that's really important. That's a really important thing to understand for those who are listening. What we were just discussing here a little while ago about the different genocides that have occurred over the years towards the native peoples, that is the exact same thing that could happen here and now with the rest of us that are, in the quote unquote modern culture. If it can happen to them, it can happen to anybody, basically.
Well, see, the thing was with this project called the United States of America, whatever that means. Initially, the objective was when the so-called colonies, English colonies, there were also French and Spanish and Dutch, etc. But when the English colonies were established in the early 1600s on the east coast of North America, at first they were very small, and they barely made it between the winters and their lack of familiarity with the land. That those two factors in and of themselves almost did them in. But they were replenished with supplies from across the Atlantic, and so after a few years, the early, very small settlements began to expand further west into the interior of the North American continent. But from the beginning, the English crown, the King and Queen of England, chartered companies. The Virginia Company, the New England Company, I believe it was called, and then also there was the London Company, which was a royal chartered company that was overarching over the first two companies. So the state of Virginia ultimately developed over the decades and centuries from the Virginia Company, which founded the very small town colonial settlement of Jamestown. And so from the very beginning, it was a commercial undertaking, a corporate venture. From the beginning, the United States has been a commercial enterprise. So the average person who's upset now about the corporations are taking over, it began this first the colonization of the continent, later the establishment of the country, and now this in-your-face transition to a corporatocracy. They're about to drop all pretense of, what you might call democracy or a Republican form of government, and just have a naked rule by corporations. It's been that way for a long time, but it's coming more and more into the open. They're dropping their veils. But what I'm saying is that it was that way from the beginning. And when the project had a corporate undertaking from the very beginning, the emphasis was on exploiting the continent and exploiting the people that were on the continent, whether they were so-called native peoples or the indentured servants that were soon brought over in large numbers and worked like slaves, many of them to death, and or the actual slaves who were brought over by the millions and who were literally worked like slaves. So people say, well, this was cruel and vicious. Yes, it was, by design. That was baked in the cake from the beginning. And so what we're seeing now is those people along the way, mostly white, but not only, who thought that, well, I'm free, or at least I'm pretty free, and things could be worse. Those people who all along had the wool pulled over their eyes and who were also being exploited, though most of them did not tumble to that. Most of them didn't wrap their mind around the fact that they too were being exploited. Even those people, Ira, are about to understand, not only am I being exploited, but they want to get rid of me.
You're absolutely right. When you look at the way that things work, right now we have the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership. They just
And
passed
no
it
one
through
knows
the
what's
Senate.
in it, Ira.
Right, exactly. They just passed it through the Senate as far as the fast tracking to Obama is concerned, and of course he's going to sign it if it goes through the House of Representatives, which it's going to be going through there next week, basically. You know, this thing is a horror show in the making, and people don't understand what really is involved with it. You know,
Well,
the corporations literally will rule.
No one knows the language of this agreement.
Exactly.
You can't read what's in it. So how the fact that it's being kept secret, that right there puts to rest the myth of free, fair, and open government. This new trade agreement, which evidently is about to impact every aspect of daily life, up, down, and sideways, we don't know what it is.
The things that have been leaked out of it are just horror shows. You know, we've just had little snippets of information released that have come out, and those alone are enough to make me tremble. You know, it really is. It's a sick situation.
It's naked tyranny, Ira.
Yes.
And as I was saying, I suspect this could be the Jade Helm operation is probably a multi-purpose operation, and I think if the TPP is enacted and it begins to be put in practice and people realize how horrendous it is and rebel, we see the United States military is really a mercenary force. It works for the Fortune 500 companies. And so when they say, you know, the people don't want to obey this new corporate regime, not political regime, corporate regime, and they're refusing to adhere to the terms of the TPP, why don't you know the military is sent out to enforce corporate rule? It does the bidding of the, well, shall we say the petroleum complex.
That's a big one, yeah. That's a big one.
It also does the bidding of the international narcotics complex. That's why the American military is in Afghanistan.
Yeah, they're there guarding the opium fields.
Facilitate the production and transport of opium internationally. It's why the United States military goes into a lot of places to make it easy for the Fortune 500 companies to do business, or to make it possible for them to do business on terms that are favorable to the major corporations. The United States military has been doing that for at least the last century and even longer. It is a corporate mercenary force. It does not fight on the side of truth, right, freedom, justice, democracy, etc. The United States military is an equal opportunity oppressor occupying force.
I always say it's an equal opportunity exploiter.
Well, I mean,
really
this is what they did, already beginning with the Indian Removal Act of the first part of the 19th century under Andrew Jackson, when the United States Army rounded up native groups in the southeastern part of North America and moved them en masse, the ones that didn't run away and hide in the swamps, moved them en masse halfway across the continent to what is now Oklahoma, and told them that the Oklahoma territory would be theirs. Well, that was false. It wasn't probably 30 or 40 years until they were overwhelmed in Oklahoma, and all of those agreements were reneged upon by the United States military and the so-called United States government in Washington, D.C. And this has happened again and again. And then later, after the Civil War, there was round two of let's go whip up on the Indians, which they did, meaning the United States military. And after the United States military finished vanquishing the rebellious southern states, hordes of them, thousands and thousands, were released from combat against the Confederate Army, to go west of the Mississippi. And they did go in great numbers and with great military force and kill and or subjugate the great majority of native peoples west of the Mississippi. But having done that, no sooner was that finished and basically wrapped up by sometime in the 1880s. Not too long after that, there was the war against Spain. And then, they stole Puerto Rico. And Puerto Rico to this day is a possession of the United States, not a state, but it's a possession of the United States. But it was gained in warfare. And also about the same time, the United States Navy stole the Kingdom of Hawaii. The United States Navy sailed its warships into the Hawaiian Islands and said, you know what? You're American. There was an autonomous Kingdom of Hawaii. It was all illegal, but it was done. And then they, shortly after the war with Spain, well, about 16, 18 years went by, and the United States was at war in Europe in World War I. And there were also invasions of Cuba and Nicaragua and Haiti and the Dominican Republic, and it just never has ended. The United States government, the United States military, has been at war about 90% of the time, ever since the late 1700s.
Yeah, actually, the statistic that I ran across just not too long ago said that in the 250 or so years that the United States has existed, formally, there's only been 35 years worth of time that it has not been at warfare in one way, shape, or form. That's a pretty sad statistic.
Well, it is, and what it tells you is that war is the business of the United States. And the first task was to militarily pacify the North American continent. Well, it took them the better part of 1 century to do that. But they did, more or less, militarily pacify the North American continent. The same thing was taking place in Canada under the English at the same time. Having pacified North America, more or less, there's resentment and there's simmering rebellion to this day, but there's not outright warfare as there was in the 19th century. Now, that may change in the coming months, and nothing would surprise me less. But having pacified the North American continent militarily, the project was, in short order, within mere years, expanded globally to the Caribbean, to Central America, to Southeast Asia, to the Philippines, then to Europe. And it's never stopped. It just goes on and on. Now it's in North Africa, the Middle East, Central Asia, and horror of horrors, the Pentagon is pushing militarily hard up right against the borders of Russia and China, both of whom have nuclear missiles that can reach the mainland United States in less than 1/2 hour. So, Ira, this project of global conquest is about to enter a very, very serious stage. I would submit that if the Pentagon, in its infinite wisdom, decides to go to war against Russia and China, that will probably mean nuclear war, and that will kill a lot of people very fast.
I am not in disagreement with you with that. One thing I will add, though, as well, is I think that the new warfare has actually been going on now for quite some time, and that is the cyber style of warfare, basically trying to take ownership of different facets of the internet. We've seen a lot of attacks on behalf of China that's been happening over the past couple of months now, and they have been increasing. In fact, just a couple of weekends ago, there was a large attack that came from the Chinese area that it was basically being spread from Russia down to China, and from China then into the United States, right into the heart of the United States. And essentially, if they are able to knock out the internet, or let's say take control of the internet, everything is connected. It's intimately associated with the internet, including our power supplies, our water supplies, the gas, everything is all intimately interdependent upon the internet. So if they were to knock it out, we're done. I mean, it's been estimated basically that if the internet was to be knocked out right now, 90% of the population would be dead within a year.
Well, that's we would find out for sure it'd be a heavy blow. I would say that with respect to these alleged cyber warfare attacks against the United States from Russia and China, if the mainstream news media are putting forth that story, I'm from, Missouri. Show me, because I don't believe anything that comes from the Western mainstream news media anymore. And all that I see is that the push for war, whether it's cyber war, economic warfare, is coming from the United States, not from Russia, not from China. Now, I'm sure the Russians and Chinese have a cyber warfare capability, but the greater cyber warfare capability is certainly in the hands of the NSA and the CIA.
Oh, you're absolutely right there. Yes.
Hands down by a factor of 10 to 1, if not 100 to 1.
Yep.
It's the NSA that is interfering with internet worldwide. It's the NSA that is surveilling and monitoring everyone and everything worldwide. Preeminently, the United States agencies, military and non-military, are the ones pushing for war. It's the United States that has imposed economic sanctions against Russia, not the other way around. It's the United States that has sent a mercenary war to the very border of Russia, not the Russians who've done that to the Americans, and so on. It's the United States who's created the ISIS mercenary army from hell in the Middle East that's chopping people's heads off by the hundreds and by the thousands. Again and again and again, the push towards war and towards international chaos is coming not from the Chinese, not from the Russians. It's coming from the United States, from Washington, D.C., which I have taken to calling Mordor on the Potomac.
I like that. Yes. That is a great analogy right there, actually. I love that one. I'm gonna have to use that one. That's awesome.
And I've also begun in some of my recent blog posts to refer to American soldiers as Pentagon orcs.
That is great. See, I'm a big fantasy and sci-fi fan, so you're touching on a good point there for me.
Well, I mean, look. The American military is sent into country after country after country.
By the hordes.
By the thousands and tens of thousands. And they slaughter, they destroy, they drone, they commit all kinds of war crimes, and yet people are forever saying, but we have to support our troops.
Oh, God, that is one thing that I get so aggravated by. That is like one of my big pet peeves when I see people, I see them on Facebook, sending out a picture, support the troops, and it's got a picture of a soldier on it, and everybody shares it, and everybody wants to say, yes, support our troops. That's not supporting your troops. And why should we support the troops that are doing the things that they do?
And you have these high school cheerleaders tying big ribbons and bows on trees. It's nauseating. I don't support the troops because the United States military is committing war crimes and crimes against humanity and has been doing that. They have been doing that for the last 200 years.
You're absolutely right, Richard. Absolutely right.
They started with war crimes, crimes against humanity, and what amounts to genocide against multiple native peoples in North America. You're from the Miami people. Is that the Miami of what we call the Midwest today?
Yes, it is. I'm one of the groups that actually remained behind in Indiana while the rest moved over into Oklahoma. So I'm not from one of the officially recognized tribes because my people stayed behind, basically. And
some did, and not everyone, not all native people east of the Mississippi were wiped out. There were pockets here and there that against long odds and with great difficulty did hang on, and their descendants survived down to the present day. but they were certainly steamrolled.
Oh yeah.
In 100 different ways, and but even in Virginia, which was the site of the original English colonization on the east coast of North America, there still are a few thousand Native Americans and some native reserves, but they have they've had a tough time. It hasn't been easy.
Yeah, the reservations. If you really take a look at what goes on these different reservations, I mean, it really is a third world country within the United States. There's no getting by that. It really is a state of devastation.
And there's a lot of crime. There's a lot of child abuse. There's a lot of baby rape and child rape. I know about this. I was my last anti-nuclear missile demonstration was in North Dakota. Actually, on the United States military has put nuclear missiles actually on the reservation of the 3 affiliated tribes north of Bismarck, right along the Missouri River. And I actually went over the fence onto one of those nuclear missile silos. And then I was jailed just north of that for a couple of days, north of that reservation, and then moved over to Minot, where I spent about 10 days in jail. And then I was moved over to Rugby, North Dakota, and spent about 3 months in jail over there. And then I was brought back for a couple of days to the jail in Minot for trial. So I was locked up. There are a lot of Native Americans in the Dakotas, and the jails I was in had Native Americans, especially at Rugby. There were a lot of Native Americans. The jail in Rugby has a contract with the BIA because the jails on the reservations in the upper Midwest are so full that the crime on the reservations vastly exceeds the ability of the reservation police to deal with it. So they contract out their prisoners to other jails, including the jail in Rugby. And I'd say a good 85% of the prisoners at the jail in Rugby were Native American from various reservations and tribes, and mostly in the Dakotas, but also in Minnesota, Kansas, Montana, etc. And so I really got a really good sense for what's going on in the reservations in the north central part of the United States, and it's grim. Those young men, and they're just coming in and out. Every week, some go and others come. They're gangbangers. They're role models of the Crips and the Bloods from Los Angeles. True. They're pimps. They're barroom brawlers. They are murderers. They are rapists, including. There's a real epidemic of even baby rape. Yeah, you're absolutely right. And so, I mean, what does it mean when a father rapes his own 2-month-old baby girl or baby boy? What does that mean?
Well, they've done everything that they can do to dehumanize them, and that is a real big sign of that dehumanization. Yes. On the other hand, how low do you have to go to reach that point? Right. Where you're raping your own, not just 15-year-olds, but my God, 2-year-olds and 2-month-olds. How low do you have to go? Dogs don't even do that. You're right, exactly. So what I'm telling you is, those who whatever may have been true about Native culture 500 years ago, in the 21st century, we have to say it's over, because I've seen these young bucks, these 18 and 20-year-olds, these 25-year-olds. They're incorrigibly violent. They have a criminal mentality. They are not normal human beings by any stretch of the imagination, and there is a whole wave of them. The soul has literally been removed from the people. The soul is gone. Yeah. And not just the native soul, the human soul. The human soul, exactly. I wasn't sure I was dealing with human beings. And I was one of the guys I was in a cell with was a serial murderer. And I talked with him a lot.
He started by murdering his own cousin, 13 years old, and just went on from there. And a whole lot of other crimes he committed in addition to murder. I believe the feds put him in my cell hoping that they'd kill two birds with one stone, that he would kill me, and then that they could then sentence him to death and send him back to Supermax. I don't know. It was you never know what's going on when you're locked up.
Yeah.
But he was telling me about Native culture and traditional Native beliefs, and I didn't confront him with the blatant contradiction in his own life. You know, you're telling me about how white people killed your people, and it wasn't all white people, but it was mostly the military. Certainly, I never killed any Native person. I hope I don't. I don't want to. But the issue is that, look at him. He killed his own cousin. 13-year-old girl. And why did he kill her? To keep her from ratting him out because she observed another murder. She had some information about another murder he'd committed, so he killed her to shut her up in front of her mother, to shut the mother up, to say, look, I'll kill your own daughter right in front of you, so shut your trap, lady. But he was killing his own family members.
Do you think, and we'll have to take a break here in a minute, but do you think that because I think so, a lot of the information that people spread around about the Native tradition beliefs and all of the things that are associated with it and the peace, love, and light that goes with it, do you think that a lot of that is actually a propaganda mechanic that's being used?
I don't know. You see, on the one hand, you had the naked aggression of the American military, and of course the settlers who came west hard on the heels of the military accepted the spoils of the military conquest. So they to a degree are also culpable. But to use Custer, for example, the three affiliated tribes fought with Custer against the Sioux. So the whole story about what happened on the Great Plains is not simple to begin with. It's
right.
Simple on one level, but on another level, you had natives who took up arms against each other. You had native groups who fought with the American military against other native peoples. And once those native peoples were vanquished, then the American military turned right around and said, right, now that we've killed them, you know what? You're going to live right here and you're not going to move. This place is called your reservation. And so it's true that the American military committed great crimes, but it's also true that many native groups committed great crimes against one another.
And they were very complicit in the whole actions that were taking place.
I'll give you the Spanish in Mexico, for example. When Cortez arrived in Mexico, I only had a few hundred men, and he was outnumbered by the Aztecs by millions. When he saw what he was up against, he burned the ships in the harbor there in what is now Veracruz, because he knew that the men would rebel once they saw the vast forces they were up against, so that there was no going back, only forward. And they conquered the mighty Aztec Empire. They marched into Mexico City, and they were outnumbered 1,000 to 1. And in short order, they conquered the Aztec Empire because there were divisions within the native culture in Mexico that they violently exploited and got the so-called natives to kill each other. Because 500 Spaniards with muskets, you fire once, right? And then you got to spend the next minute reloading. So how's that going to work? Not too well if you're surrounded by 50,000
exactly
armed warriors. But the Spanish knew that. So they within a matter of days, weeks at the most, they noticed these divisions in native society. This group doesn't like that group. This faction doesn't like that faction. And they got them to kill each other. And then the Spanish just kind of stood back and said, okay, right, we're in charge.
And I would posit that we're seeing that. I would posit that we're seeing that exact thing happen right now with the whole divide and conquer that goes on within the global consciousness. Yes.
It's an ancient tactic. It goes back to Roman days.
Yep.
Roman days, if not before. The Romans would come into a region and they would quickly send out their spies and diplomats and ambassadors to find out who doesn't like whom. Who wants to kill whom? Right. Who wants to kill whom the worst? Well, those are the ones that are going to fight with us. And as soon as we get through killing their bad guys, we'll turn right around and kill them.
The enemy of my enemy is my friend, at least for a minute.
Well, and this is the thing that, the great Battle of Tippecanoe, for example, there were efforts on the part of some native leaders to say, look, this is madness. We're wiping each other out. We're fighting with the French against the English. We're fighting with the French against the Spanish. We're fighting with the colonial continental army against the British. And then it just went on for, a couple centuries. And and there were some Native American visionaries who did travel around the interior of the continent and try to say to the various nations and tribes, this is madness. We are helping them wipe us out. We need to unite amongst ourselves and set aside our petty differences because the game has changed. And unless we realize that and adapt another strategy, we're done. And you know what? Not enough native people could wrap their heads around that idea. And so they're done.
That's exactly right. This is a great lesson in history, and it's also a great lesson in the future because this exact type thing is happening for everyone. Exactly. We need to take a break real quick, Richard. When we come back, we're going to get into more. I think this has been a really great conversation so far, and I'm really enjoying it, even in spite of the fact that it is a little dark. And it's kind of gone in directions that I didn't expect, but I think that this is very important for people to understand. This stuff has happened in the past, and history always repeats itself, especially when you forget about it. So stick around with us.
Ira history doesn't repeat itself. It just never ends.
You've got it. Yes, that is a really better way to put it. Yes. We'll be back in just a few minutes, guys. Stick around.
Inflicted in a major way on the other peoples, non-native peoples of North America. And part of that is certainly this underground system of underground bases and tunnels that I've written about over the years, over the last 20 years or so. This program was set into motion after World War II, maybe even before World War II, but it was kicked up into another gear after World War II and has never stopped. There are many of these underground facilities. Some of them are so secret that we truly don't know where they are and what happens in them. Some of them are publicly known, and I identify a good number of them in my books, which are available through my website. And I know that you've put up a link to my website, and if people want to get the books, they can find them on the right-hand sidebar.
Yes,
of my blog site.
When you go to the website, when you go to my archive of my website, you'll find the links for Richard's books right there as well. So definitely, I would recommend picking them up. You've written 2 about this subject specifically, correct?
No, 3.
Okay.
And the starting in the mid '90s and continuing right up into the first part of this century, because it's tremendously difficult subject to research. Notwithstanding that, I did find a surprising amount of information on the public record, and also some people have talked to me and given me bits of information, little tidbits of data here and there. There's no doubt that these facilities exist. Some of them can be quite large and quite deep. In the medieval period, the political control structure operated out of heavily fortified castles that would made of stone that were very large and solid, frequently on top of hills or mountains, or in the middle of, even in the middle of rivers, and very hard to assault militarily, even if you were equipped with weapons of that day and had a large fighting force. They were hard to conquer. These underground bases and undersea bases, in a sense, are the equivalent of the medieval castles in Europe 1,000 years ago, but much, much harder to get into, much, much harder to access. And I believe as we go forward into what looks like probably some kind of martial law or military government that's dictatorship that is even now has begun to be imposed on the mainland United States, that the underground bases will certainly play a role in that, because you can't get in unless you have authorized access.
I know we've had, in our location, I live in Fort Wayne, Indiana, and over the past 20 years or so, there have been continuing, like once a year, maybe twice a year, there will be reports, and I've heard them myself, of these big booms that seem to be coming from underground, and it almost seems like there is some kind of digging that's going on underneath the surface, and I've always wondered how much of that was related to these underground tunnels or bases. We have a big military presence here in our town, and so it would not surprise me if that is exactly what has been going on here in our location. And I know that similar has happened, all across the United States, of course. What do you think actually is I guess the main purpose for it? Is it just defense, or is it sort of their way of? I've heard over the years that some people say that maybe it's they're building an ark kind of a situation in case crap happens, basically, that they can continue things on. I don't think that way myself. I think that they have kind of more nefarious purposes that are in mind with it, but that's my own personal take.
Well, Ira, that's an excellent question. The answer is a little bit multifaceted, in that my research clearly shows that there are multiple purposes for these bases, multiple agencies involved. The military agencies are involved, but not only them. And it's not only government agencies either. So you have a variety of actors and agencies and organizations involved underground and also undersea. Because you can make facilities down in the bedrock, beneath the ocean floor, beneath the sea floor, and they can even be hundreds of miles out to sea, well off the coast, out in the ocean, but down beneath the sea floor. I write about this in my second and third books, Underwater and Underground Bases, and also Hidden in Plain Sight, Beyond the X-Files. But the purposes can vary. Using the military installations as one example, they could be they could have a function of weapons, storage, and deployment, whether nuclear or other weapons. They could have a command, control, and communication function. They could indeed have an arc function. Some of them appear to have an arc function, like for people, select group or groups to ride out a nuclear hellstorm or some other great catastrophe, to go topside after it's all clear and reestablish society. Some of them seem to have a technological base, in that I talked with one engineer who told me there are several very deep, extremely technologically sophisticated and complex bases that are designed to jumpstart technological civilization in the event of a civilization-ending war, for example, an all-out nuclear war. The idea is that in these facilities they have all of the steel they need, the raw ingredients for glass, for rubber, to make transistors, vacuum tubes, car tires, you name it, from A to Z, to make them from scratch. They have the industrial facilities deep underground, cutting edge stuff, where they could from scratch make a bicycle or a generic automobile, a functional jet plane or railroad locomotive, or etc., on, television, radio. So that if it all went kablooey, their plan is that after a period of time, when things quiet down topside, they come out. And they're not going to go back to the Stone Age. At least that's their plan. At the worst, they'll go back to the second half of the 20th century in terms of the technology base. They'll make some airplanes. They'll make some automobiles. They'll make some motorcycles. They'll begin making railroads, and they can make the steel tracks. They can make radios. They can make radio receivers and transmitters. So they won't be going back thousands of years, or even 200 years, or even 100 years. They'll start it all over again. At least that's their plan. So that's part of it.
Well, and I will say as well, I mean, that it goes right into what I say sometimes on my show, that those who are the elite, the ones that are in charge of things, you know, they don't think in terms like most of the average people do, you know, that think paycheck to paycheck or week to week, or maybe a month or two out. They think generationally. They think, what are we going to be able to do now to impact or affect the next generation, or even 2 generations from now? You know, they don't think in those terms.
Or even a century or 500 years from
Precisely.
Now. It's a different world entirely. Now, of course, the slaves, the great unwashed herd of humanity is oppressed and prevented from thinking that way, the better, to manipulate and exploit them. Now, other possibilities are for storing military supplies, for storing government and corporate records, as I've been told informally. I can't prove it, but I've been told as places for ETs to come and go. Can I prove that? No. But they seem to be here, and they seem to be interacting with very secretive elements of the military, for example. So I am presuming that the stories probably have some truth to them.
Yeah, there's at least a grain of truth to it.
Pardon me?
I said, yeah, there's at least a grain of truth to it.
I suspect there is, yes. Though I can't prove a word of it because I'm not on the inside of those super secret projects. And those who are don't talk, or at least not very much, yeah. And not to many people. And then others, in the case of the undersea bases, the documentation I got from the United States Navy and also from Stanford Research Institute in California forthrightly talk about making very large, manned, very deep bases down in the seafloor, in the bedrock, beneath the bottom of the ocean. Bases in which large numbers of men can live and work. And also, I saw some suggestion of stationing families down there. If that has been done, we may now be into the second or third or even fourth generation of subsea, very, very tightly compartmentalized projects where you would have both genders. Most men would not want to go away and live sealed off from women for a long period of time in an undersea base, for example. So if this has been done and operationalized, and I've been told the bases are there, then it wouldn't surprise me if there are women and children out there, down there rather, and that for them, that is their world, the world of tunnels and undersea bases, and they don't come out. We don't go in, and they don't come out.
They did that in Turkey. I mean, if you look at some of the different cities that have been found underground in Turkey, a lot of those places were used for generations. You know, when the
even
surface,
thousands of years ago.
Exactly. And so, I mean, that right there is proof enough. If people don't believe that it's possible for these things to occur, they were doing it thousands of years ago. So yeah. These things absolutely can and do happen.
I suspect it's been done, but those projects are so tightly compartmentalized that I'm surprised people have even talked to me as much as they have. Nonetheless, the plans are there, and these bases, people have to understand, can bring in submarines underwater through tunnels into these bases. Now, military submarines, modern military submarines, are 400, 500, 600 feet long. They're huge, and they have crews of 60, 80, 100 men, 150 men, sometimes more, the very large ones. And the designs I saw, dating back to the 1960s, were already planning to bring in 3, 4, 5, 6 very large military submarines at a time. So these bases, from the beginning in the R&D phase, were designed to accommodate hundreds of men in creature comfort, deep undersea, and their submarines. Now, what I've been told is these facilities exist. One that's been mentioned to me is on Andros Island in the Bahamas. It's the so-called Alltech base. But I was told by one of your alternative media radio colleagues that he was actually in one of these, in Andros base, and that they bring in the large American military submarines through tunnels underwater, and then the base itself is underground on Andros Island in the Bahamas off the coast of Florida. That is not an American government territory, but is either leased or has been stolen from the Bahamians. It is an American military facility, and he told me they bring in multiple Ohio-sized submarines at a time. These are enormous submarines, like 600 feet long.
Yes, they are huge. My stepfather was captain on a nuclear submarine. These things are massive. That you would not imagine how much things could be stored in one of these things.
And yet these bases can accommodate multiple large military submarines and their crews that come right in. So there's that function for the undersea bases. Another function that I saw listed in the literature was for scientific research and also for industrial purposes. If you have your own private gold mine in the middle of the ocean or your own private uranium mine, you can realize billions of dollars of profit. I assume those facilities exist simply because they're so profitable. But they would be secret, you see.
Right. It goes into where the money for some of these black projects come from. You know, it's not just the drugs that are being sold and so forth. It's not just the money that's been earmarked for the black project use. They do things like this, what you're just speaking about right now. They'll go in and get resources and sell them on the open market, basically.
On the open market or on the black market.
Right.
They don't care. On the black market, for their purposes, would be even better, because they wouldn't have a Chicago Comex paper trail, for example.
Right.
So all of that is going on and more. I have been told stories about, and read stories also about, ET bases, alien bases down on the seafloor or beneath the seafloor. I believe those stories. I think quite a lot of that is going on. The United States military also has an active subsurface presence. And I talk about this in my book, Hidden in Plain Sight, Beyond the X-Files. John Pena Craven, who was a PhD oceanographer, was tasked by the United States Navy to develop the capacity to work at 20,000 feet deep, 20,000 feet beneath the surface of the sea, to routinely work at that depth. He wrote a book about that called Silent War. Silent War. John Pena Craven is now dead. But the United States Navy developed a very wide range of technology for going down 4 miles deep, and I believe even deeper, and working there.
We have knowledge that the military, just for the United States alone, the military is at least 50 years advanced from what we in the general population have access to. So you can imagine what kind of technologies, or even, can't imagine what kind of technologies they would have access to that are hidden from us,
Well, one of those technologies were the deep submergence rescue vehicles that John Pena Craven was tasked with developing. After they lost the Thresher, and what was the Thresher and the other submarine that the Americans lost back in the 60s, the Navy came to John Pena Craven and said, we have to be able to go down and rescue these guys when these submarines fail at great depth. So they did, and they developed the deep submergence rescue vehicles, which ostensibly have been retired. I have my doubts. I think that some of them are still in active duty. I believe more of them were built and were publicly acknowledged, and that some of them still remain in active duty.
And the technology could be built on from there as well.
Well, that's correct. Anyway, these were designed to go way down, I think 2,000 feet or more, and lock on to the hatches of sunken submarines and rescue the crews if possible. My belief and my guess is that these were also crew transfer modules between and to and from the very deep underground bases. Underwater bases. John Pena Craven says in his book that the DSRV vehicles had capabilities that have never been publicly revealed, and missions that they were capable of carrying out that have never been publicly discussed. I believe that was part of what he was alluding to. The rest of it, you put your finger right on it. There have been great technological advances in the military-industrial complex that have been held back, purposefully held back from the general population. That would be just one example.
We know that there are patents on the books. For instance, in the 1970s, they released a patent for a machine that was capable of, if I remember correctly, it was capable of digging tunnels, very wide, usable tunnels, 6 kilometers per day.
Well, that's an exaggeration, I believe. I don't think the 6-kilometer capability exists, simply because working at great depth underground is very tricky. One of the things that you run into undersea and underground is subterranean streams of water. And if you run into that, that's a big issue. So dealing with water underground, even in the desert, I mean, there are strata where you have water. And so dealing with water when you're in an enclosed space deep underground or deep undersea is a huge issue. So you can't just barrel along at miles per day. I doubt that capability exists.
Well, maybe they have the capability, but they just don't do it.
You can do 5 or 10 miles per year, however. And that is something that I've seen mentioned again and again in the literature.
Yeah.
5 or 10 miles per year. But you see, if you have 10 tunnel boring machines and you're doing 10 miles per year with each machine in good rock you can do that. In faulty or fractured rock or rock that has a lot of underground water, you're going to go slower, no doubt. But if you're in good rock and there's not much water, can you make 10 miles a year? Yeah, you could.
Absolutely.
And if you have 10 machines working, you could make 100 miles a year, and in a decade you could make 1,000 miles, a 1,000-mile tunnel. But you see, if you're an agency that has a budget of billions of dollars and thousands of employees, it's nothing to go out and buy your own fleet of tunnel boring machines. And if you keep at it for 10 or 20 or 30 years, sure, you can make thousands of miles of secret tunnels. And my belief is that's been done.
Yeah.
If you're not on the inside of those projects, you don't know what's been done. If you're on the inside, you can't talk about it. If you're on the outside, you don't know. And even if you're on the inside of a compartmentalized project, you know what's happening in your little corner of that one project. More than that, you don't know.
Yeah, exactly. It's like when I talk about compartmentalization on my show, sometimes I give the reference or the analogy that let's say that you are building a radio, for instance, but you have compartmentalized people away. You have one person who is just soldering a part onto a board, and then they pass it on to the next person, and that person solders another part onto the board, and so on and so forth down the line. None of them know what the end result is until you get to the end result, which is the radio. But every one of them is so divided away from each other that they never see that end result. So they're all only knowing exactly what they've been told to do or what they've been able to see, and that's it. They have no knowledge of anything else.
That's correct, and I can give you a specific example of that. I talked to the man who spent his whole career as an underground hard rock miner for a variety of United States government agencies, always in the West, North American West. He was one of the original miners when the United States Air Force started to make the so-called Monsanto underground base on the outskirts of, right on the edge of Kirtland Air Force Base, on the southeast part of Albuquerque, New Mexico. This was back in the immediate post-World War II period in the late 1940s. He was contracted to work on that facility, which I've been told is now vast and just sprawls. It is vast, very large, very sophisticated, very tightly controlled. But it began humbly in the late 1940s. He and the other miners would be blindfolded before they were taken underground. They would go in, and the blindfold would be taken off, and then they would work on whatever room or chamber or tunnel, portion of tunnel that they were tasked with working on. At the end of the day, they would be blindfolded again and taken back out. Now, when they finished whatever little section of tunnel they were working on, a room or cavern, they would be blindfolded and taken to another part of the mountain. And this went on for a period of years, with the result that at the end of the project, the very men who had tunneled out that underground base could not tell you its internal layout. None of them knew. The men who built that underground base could not tell you its layout. They had no clue.
And I would say that most people that were involved in that project would fall right under that same category. There's maybe only one or two at the very top who have knowledge of what the whole facility would look like.
That's right. The ones at the top would know. The ones who had the need to know. The miners themselves did not have a need to know. They were there to earn a paycheck to make X tunnel, Y cavern, Z room, A, T shaft that was all numbered and labeled. I'll tell you another anecdote I heard about that particular facility. Of course, New Mexico, a lot of mountains in New Mexico, and that region is mountainous. Throughout the Mountain West, there are mineral reserves. Of course, uranium, there's gold, there's copper, there's tungsten, there's silver, etc. There are a lot of lead, what have you. There's a lot of mineral wealth in the mountains, in the Mountain West, including in New Mexico, including in that mountain. Don't you know, as they were tunneling along, from time to time they ran into veins of gold, which the commanding generals that were directing the project confiscated for their own personal use. No one knows how much gold, 100 pounds, 1,000 pounds, 5 tons, 10 tons. Under national security, the commanding generals of the project confiscated and took charge of all of the gold that was encountered during the tunneling. Just one example. Talk about a little black budget pocket change.
Yes. Oh, wow. That's a really good point. I really, wow, that's something to think about, because you don't think about that when you think about these different tunnels and that kind of thing that's been created. There really is a lot of mineral wealth that is down there.
There's a twofer. When you make a big base like the Cheyenne Mountain Base in Colorado, for example, which is now being reactivated. It's a huge facility.
Oh, yeah.
When that thing was tunneled out, of course, the mountains in Colorado have a great deal of mineral wealth, just as the mountains in Nevada and New Mexico and Arizona do. I'm willing to guess that they encountered a fair amount of silver and gold while they were drilling and blasting out that mountain. And you better believe all of that was a classified project. You better believe whatever gold and silver they ran across was just melted down, refined, and funneled straight into the black budget.
Yes, indeed. Exactly. You know, one thing that I've heard over the years, and you might be able to give some information regarding this because you're down in that area. One thing I've heard over the years is the idea that there are a lot of tunnels down in South America as well that have actually been in existence for many, many years. Have you ever encountered any of those yourself?
Not personally. I've heard the stories, not personally. Ira, frankly, the facts of my life are very hard. I have very little money. I simply absolutely lack the money to travel around and chase down these rumors. I flat out don't have it. Any money I get my hands on goes for room and board. That's it. For food and for a roof over my head. Now, I was almost killed by a native shaman down here in December 29, 2012. And I was hospitalized for more than 4 months. I'm still recuperating. The man almost killed me. He's comes from one of the Quechua-speaking groups in the Amazon region of Ecuador. I lived with him for a year. I learned some things about native Amazonian shamanism. In my last days with him, he almost killed me. I mean, very nearly killed me. And so I've been recuperating ever since. I still do not walk well. At this point, I do walk. Initially, I couldn't. I was I spent weeks in bed and gradually regained some nerve function. I was savagely abused by him and his family members. I can now walk, but I'm not back to the point where I have the strength and the flexibility in my ankles and my feet to go into mountainous terrain. That's one thing I hope to do in the future, but, you know, priorities are priorities, and right now I'm focusing on my health, and I spend a lot of time exercising or trying to exercise. I've come back literally from the doorway of death, and I believe it was his intention to kill me. I believe the fact that I survived his multifaceted, near-fatal assault was somewhat of a shock to him, and I think after trying to kill me over a period of hours, I survived, and he perceived that there were some spiritual forces involved, and he desisted. That's my belief.
I definitely know where you're coming from. I've had similar experiences over the years, and I'm now blind actually because of certain things, and so I definitely know and understand where you're coming from with that.
Sorry about that.
Well, you know, everything for a reason is how I always look at life, and I know that there are reasons why this has occurred, and so that's interesting though. When you were mentioning that,
I think, by the way, Ira, I think he killed me because I went pretty far into the plants. The plants are hyperconscious that the shamans use down here. They're hyperconscious, and I think some of the things that I was saying made him uncomfortable. And so he decided to do away with me.
See, I was going to ask along those lines. Yeah, I was going to ask along those lines. So you can maybe...
There's a dark side. There's a dark side to indigenous shamanism in South America. I mean, a real dark side. Just because someone is Native American and they're a shaman and they live in the jungle, in and of itself does not mean that is a nice guy.
Right.
He may be a rapist, a serial murderer, a drunk, and a wife beater. And you know what? Some of them are.
Absolutely. That is one thing that I would love for people to understand when it comes to all of the different things that they hear. I mean, you can't believe everything that you read or hear.
The propaganda that's put out by the Ministry of Tourism here in Ecuador, for example, is come to the Amazon. spend time with native people in the jungle. Go on walks. Watch them do their native dances and partake of their food and everything. And what's put forth in the tourism industry is, oh, these are such pure, good, well-intentioned people. Some of them, I wouldn't say all of them.
And how much of those people that the tourists encounter are actually like actors, basically?
Well, you tell me.
That'd be the good question, right?
Well, they're all of indigenous origin. I mean, genetically they're indigenous, but
right.
What can I tell you? There's still a black market in human heads in Amazon.
Wow. Yeah, it really is a different world from what people
let me tell
would
you,
think.
When I was living in Amazon, there was a young girl in the town near where I was living who disappeared. She was in junior high school. She was about 13 years old. She disappeared and from school one day, and it caused a little bit of a local scandal. It was in a newspaper, and don't you know, her headless body was found thrown away in the weeds along the Amazon highway in Indian territory a few days later. And it turned out that the national police came in and put some pressure on the parents. Her mother cracked first. Her mother sold her with the father's connivance to some men for $14,000. Sold their own 13-year-old child to some men for $14,000, who then took her. They didn't want to have sex with her. They wanted her head. They cut her head off, disposed of her body in the weeds with her school book bag still on her back and in her school uniform, and took the head. You see, the head was what they wanted, the head of a pretty young girl.
Is that, do you think, related to, I guess, sort of ancient past? You hear like how the Aztecs and Incas and Mayans sort of descended, their culture descended into that kind of anarchy.
I'm not on the inside of that activity, so anything I might say would be speculative. What I can tell you is, it goes on. It's very hush-hush. It's very criminal. No one wants to lose their head. I don't.
Yeah.
And I'm sure that young girl didn't want to lose her head, but she did, because there is a black market traffic in human heads. And are there indigenous people involved in that? Oh, you bet.
It's a sad state of affairs. It really is. That it's scary. It's
well, I'm
extremely
back to my
scary.
original point. Dogs don't even do that.
Right.
So we're dealing with a society that's fallen to below the level of dogs. And this is one thing that ayahuasca pointed out to me. It just pointed out to me that the culture in the region is degraded. Indigenous culture, yes, it's degraded. It's become, certain aspects are subhuman. Decapitating people and selling their heads, that's subhuman.
Well, it goes into the idea, I think, that they have become what they were always thought to be, but weren't at that time.
I don't know if they were or they weren't.
Well, yeah.
There's a long tradition of head hunting.
Yeah.
In the Ecuadorian Amazon, and the idea, I mean, it goes way back, and so I don't think that civilized people do that, or sophisticated people do that. It's just crude and brutal. And the idea was, well, it's never stopped, is the point. And I'm not involved in that traffic, do not desire to be, but there are people who are, and some of them are indigenous.
It really is. It's such a depraved way of thinking. Again, like you said, it's non-human.
That I have arrived at the point where I don't assume anything about anyone just because they're indigenous, or just because they're of European ancestry, or just because they're of African descent, whatever. You really have to take people as you find them.
Yes.
And I don't make any broad assumptions about indigenous culture in general, because there's some savage things that go on in indigenous culture. On the by the same token, you can't necessarily assume anything about someone just because they are white.
Yes.
There are all kinds of white people.
Including
there's
ones who are very depraved.
There's diversity. Some of them are depraved and will carve your liver out with a spoon. I mean, look at Jeffrey Dahmer, for example. Who would want to even spend 1 second with someone like that? And yet they walk among us. So it really means you have to become very discerning in everything when you're dealing in life across the board, whether you're in Amazon, whether you're in the Midwest of the United States, whether you're in a jail in Rugby, North Dakota, on and on. Every day is different, every person is different, and you always, in a certain sense, have to be prepared for just about anything, Ira.
I absolutely agree. And that is one thing that I am always advocating, is that people are, prepared for the worst and hope for the best. And when you're dealing with people, I think that is the exact same attitude to have. Don't prejudge people just based upon the color of their skin or the society that they come from, because each and every individual person is completely different.
That's right. And getting back to the underground base aspect of things, yes, I do believe there's ample evidence. I mean, just literally mounds of evidence here in South America that there was a very advanced culture here in the past. It may or may not have been Native American, but it was here. It was pre-Inca, and I mean by thousands of years, many thousands of years. And the ruins of that culture, whoever those people were, assuming they were people, Homo sapiens as we are, they may have been human-like. There's some evidence that there was a group here in South America who were human-like, but not humans. In other words, not our human family members. Another species of being, whether from the earth or from somewhere else, who knows? But whoever they were, they built on a grand scale in a way that we can't today, and in a way that we do not today. But their ruins are all over the place down here, especially in the Andean region. I've been told of tunnels. I think they exist. I believe I will go in some of them, but I haven't been yet. I'm not capable of making those kinds of journeys right now. As to more modern underground bases, there's an underground facility that NASA has right here in Ecuador, south of Quito. So they what do they do there? I don't know.
This has just been an absolutely amazing conversation. I have really enjoyed all of this so far. We have about 5 minutes left, and I would like to give you that time, kind of as your floor to get out any kind of information that you would like to get out, maybe as final thoughts. Where can people find your books? What websites do you have? I know that you have a very active blog that you work with, and all of the information that you would like for people to have. Go ahead and make sure to get out, because I really would love to point people in your direction to get information from you. You're just a wealth of it, and I've loved this conversation with you.
Thank you, Ira, and likewise, and I want to thank you for having me on. Of course, my blog site is eventhorizonChronicle.blogspot.com, and you've linked to that and my books through your podcast or radiocast website. My closing thoughts are that reality is not as we've been told. We are surrounded. We're living in a magical wonderland, but our magical wonderland reality has been hijacked. I'm not speaking metaphorically. It really has. One of the things that ayahuasca showed me is that there's a type of artificial machine-like intelligence. It's very devious, malicious, malevolent, cunning. It knows us better than we do ourselves, and it has come onto this planet and into this solar system, I believe, in a major way. It is running the show, or at least trying to run the show on this planet right now. You see its activities everywhere. in the espionage and intelligence agencies, in the Pentagon, in the Fortune 500 companies, in the banking system, in the so-called educational system, in organized religion, in popular entertainment, in Hollywood. We've had this huge, vast, false reality very harshly and violently imposed on humanity and on the planet. It's clamping down. It is relentless. It won't stop coming. The only way I know to prevail against it is to raise consciousness to the next level. Either humanity raises its game mentally, spiritually, and emotionally, and understands what it's up against, and brings its whole level of awareness to a much higher level, or don't. We can die as slaves on our knees, or we can stand on our feet as fully realized, aware men and women. If we can do that, then we have a future. If we can't do that or won't do that, I don't know if we have a future, Ira.
I'm in agreement with you completely. I have talked on my show before about visions that a friend of mine and I have had, shared visions. We've done a couple of shows on it, and come to that exact same conclusion, that we were shown that we have basically two directions to go. Either we are done as being human beings, because if we don't, resolve our issues, we're no longer going to be considered human. We will be at that point that subhuman type of, or even non-human type of entities, like you've seen different societies descending down into. And we could change things if we want to, but it has to be all of us.
It's possible. It's going to take a great effort on the part of humanity at this point, an effort that humanity to this very minute has not made, but must make. And not only do we risk becoming non-human, we risk becoming non-existent, period.
Yes.
We're snuffing ourselves.
Yes. You've got it exactly right. It's a matter of, we really are bright creative forces in the universe, but we have to remember that. And if we don't, we're creating the reality that we're living in. It's going to take as much energy to turn things around as it took to get us to this point.
It'll take an enormous effort. And if humanity cannot rouse itself and muster an enormous effort to rescue the species and the planet, then, Ira, we're done for.
You're absolutely right. Richard Sauder, this has been amazing. Thank you so much for coming on Open Eyes tonight. I definitely appreciate it, and I would love to have you back on at any time. This has just been wonderful.
Yes, sir. It's been great, and I think we can talk again.
So, guys, there you have it. Richard Sauder. This was an amazing interview. I really enjoyed having him on as a guest, and I'm have a very special guest tonight. His name is Richard Sauder, and he is an author and an author of books that I find actually to be extremely fascinating. I love the topics that we're going to be discussing tonight. So, Richard, are you there with me?
Yes, Ira, thank you. I'm right here.
Awesome. Okay, so before we really get into delving into the topics, why don't you tell the listeners a little bit about yourself, and that way they can have an understanding of where you're coming from and what you're all about.
Well, Ira, I was born in 1955 in Tidewater, Virginia. So I'm a native Virginian, a native Southerner. I grew up on the East Coast of North America. I got a bunch of degrees along the way in sociology, forestry and ecosystem management, Latin American studies, political science, and then I lived and worked in many different states in the United States. Over the years, I've also been a peace activist, an anti-nuclear activist. I've been arrested many times for staging nonviolent peace demonstrations, including directly on the launch lids of nuclear missile silos in Arkansas, Missouri, and most recently in North Dakota, on April 15, 2010. I have been incarcerated for those demonstrations. I spent a fair amount of time in many different jails, prisons, and correctional facilities in various states in the United States. Along the way, I also wrote a little series of popular paperback books on the topics of underwater and underground bases and tunnels, many of which are secret, not all of them, but many of them. And most recently in 2010, I flew to Ecuador on a shamanic vision quest, which I had wanted to do for years and years and years. And finally, at the age of 55, I decided if I'm going to do it, I'm going to do it. So I counted up my pennies and bought a plane ticket to Quito and flew down and spent a month in Ecuador traveling around the country, and somewhere around 3 weeks into the ostensible vacation or shamanic exploration or vision quest, I was walking on the beach and contemplating life and decided I'm not going back. I'm going to remain in South America. And so here I am to this day.
So basically it was a really transformative experience all the way around. Do you feel like it was a kind of a culmination?
I'm not minimizing what has happened to Native peoples in North America. It's just been demonic. There are hardly words to describe it, but it's not restricted to them. And look at what was done to Vietnam in the 1960s and 1970s.
Yes.
Look what's being done to Syria right now, to Iraq, to Libya, to Afghanistan, and look what's been done in Indonesia, in Central America, and on, just in country after country, region after region, all around the world. This is a centuries-long campaign of horror that's being inflicted on humanity. We have to inquire upon where it comes from. And by the way, a new chapter is getting ready to be opened. This is a multi-chapter saga. It's once started, it hasn't ended. It's ongoing. And another chapter is about to be opened with the so-called Jade Helm military operation that the United States military is going to initiate starting next month in several states in the United States. And actually, these military operations are ongoing. I read about one on the internet today that's taking place in Michigan right now, in Flint, Michigan.
Yeah, I just ran across that here a little while ago myself. There was a big explosion in the town.
Exactly. They're setting off explosions. They're having maneuvers in and around the city. Evidently, they're having a military operation in an abandoned junior high school in Flint, Michigan. I'm sorry, if they're having that kind of training in an American city, in a junior high school, and they're setting off explosions, the military trains for the war they're going to fight.
Yes.
So if that's their training, then it's clear as hell they're getting ready for war on the North American continent. Now, I know there were the so-called Indian Wars in the 19th century, which were more massacres and slaughters than they were wars. But what I'm telling you is something like that is coming, and probably even worse, frankly, Ira.
I see the same thing, and you know, that's really important. That's a really important thing to understand for those who are listening. What we were just discussing here a little while ago about the different genocides that have occurred over the years towards the native peoples, that is the exact same thing that could happen here and now with the rest of us that are, you know, in the quote unquote modern culture. If it can happen to them, it can happen to anybody, basically.
Well, see, the thing was with this project called the United States of America, whatever that means. Initially, the objective was when the so-called colonies, English colonies, they were also French.
Nation of your life to be down there, I guess you could say.
Well, in one sense, in that since childhood, you know, the age of 9, 10, 11, I had been fascinated when I first heard about the Mayan cultures and the Inca culture. I've been fascinated by ancient Mexican and ancient Andean culture, and I even had a book on the Mayans and another book on the Inca, which I would read, at the age of 10 or 11 years old. So that burr got into my mind at a very early age, 50 years ago. And then I went away later when I was somewhat older and did one of my master's degrees is in Latin American studies. And I ended up visiting Mexico, and I traveled pretty widely in South Central and Southern Mexico. I traveled extensively in the Mayan area and also in Guatemala, visiting many ancient Mayan ruins. And then, of course, the desire for a vision quest was something that had been a very strong wish for years and years. I've had many visionary experiences and paranormal experiences over the years, beginning at the age of 3, and those have never really ended. So, of course, along the way, I heard about shamanism and South American shamanism, and I determined I really wanted to visit the Amazon region and drink ayahuasca. So I did, and ayahuasca proved for me to be revelatory. My experience with ayahuasca has not been like a lot of the typical experiences you might read on the internet on various entheogenic web pages that have to do with the various shamanic plants that are used around the world. Nonetheless, I did have a lot of deep insights with ayahuasca, and if you like, we could get into some of that. I don't know. But one thing that resulted from that within a matter of just a few weeks was that I decided to remain, and I had a round-trip plane ticket. I was scheduled to fly back to Atlanta, and as I thought over things, I began to wonder, I'm flying back to Atlanta and to the United States, but to do what? And I began to feel as if my work in the United States was done, and that I was beginning a new chapter of my life in South America. I still feel comfortable with that decision, and as of today, I firmly intend to remain in South America, probably in Ecuador, since I've been here almost 5 years.
That's really amazing. It sounds actually a lot like my own story, except for the Ecuador part. I've lived a very paranormal life myself, and I'm Native American myself, actually, of the Miami tribe, and I've had quite a few vision quests of my own. I've never actually tried ayahuasca, but I've tried other things and used other medicinal means to enact the vision quests and so on and so forth. And it's always a very fascinating experience, especially when you come from it. Come at things from more of a scientific viewpoint on it, as opposed to more of a traditional viewpoint. You kind of get a little bit more out of it, I think, actually, when you come at it from a scientific viewpoint.
Well, yes and no. What I found is a lot of the indigenous shamans, not all of them, but many of them, have very little so-called formal education. Many of them have never traveled much, if at all, beyond the rural parts of South America where they live. They oftentimes have a lot of superstitious beliefs that may or may not correspond well to what we might call objective reality. There's alcoholism involved in Native culture, let's tell the truth. And that has a very negative effect on a lot of shamanism.
It does, yes.
There's also violence against women. That's pretty common in Native culture, whether in North America or in South America. And that lack of respect for other human beings also has a negative effect on shamanism. And I know a lot of shamans will say, well, we're one with nature and with Pachamama, who is the one word that's widely used, at least in Andean South America, to describe Mother Nature, if you will. and we're one with Pachamama, and we're one with nature, and we're all seeking God. And they'll tell you that, and then they're drinking alcohol and they're beating their wife.
Right. Yeah, I wonder how much, because I've never really done a large amount of investigation into the South American tribes and their methodologies, but I know a lot of the ones up here in North America, for instance. And I know that up until about maybe 120 or 150 or so years ago, that was not really a problem. And ever since that point in time, it really seems to have become more prevalent. And I wonder maybe
the conquest has changed everything.
Yeah, yeah.
And I wouldn't minimize the very damaging and violent and degrading effect of the mainstream culture that's been
because
imposed.
that causes a deep trauma in the genetic makeup even of that
Ira,
people's.
it actually killed a lot of people
Yes.
to begin with.
Oh yes.
So that's very traumatic in and of itself. And those who survived, of course, were carrying that emotional trauma from witnessing others being killed and fearing their own potential demise by violent means. So there was the hyper-violent aspect of it, but then having the culture overwhelmed by this very foreign global culture. It's really a global culture that has come in with alcohol. I mean, I saw in a lot of the native communities in North America, the young men, they're idolizing rap music and this urban hip-hop culture, which glorifies brutality of women. It glorifies drug dealing, narcotics trafficking. It glorifies gratuitous violence, pistol whipping people, shooting people, getting down with the homies in the hood. And so what you have is all these young Chippewa men, Ojibwe and Sioux and Navajo and on and on. They're violent. They're drug addicts, they're narco traffickers, they're alcoholics, they're pimps, and they believe that's the lifestyle they have chosen, and they're actually patterning it off of the very violent and dysfunctional poor urban black culture. And that's the reality in a lot of native areas in North America today. I've seen it.
Yeah, it's what I've come to call the Slapaho generation. Because that is lost. Really what it comes down to.
It's the end of traditional Native American culture.
Yes.
In North America.
Yes,
it's
and
the end.
I wonder. Well, I don't wonder. I mean, I know that the answer is when you look into the history of what's happened, not just with the genocides that have gone on over the years with the native tribes, but also look into what even happened up to 70 or so years ago, where most of the children get removed from the reservations and put into different like Catholic charities and wards and group homes and all of that kind of stuff, and the native literally was beaten out of them anytime that they displayed anything of their native traditions or had their hair long or anything like that. It was, they were violently struck out against because they did not want to appear savage. So a lot of those children never even went back to the reservations again because they grew to hate where they came from. And that caused a huge devastation into the tribes. They still have not recovered from any of that. So,
no, it was a very dark, brutal period, and unfortunately, Native peoples are not the only ones who have been treated like that. You see, that agenda has not been restricted just to so-called Native peoples in North America. It's really a global conquest agenda.
You're right.
You can see the